Sarah Martinez pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Lincoln High School. It was 6:30 in the evening, and most people had gone home hours ago. The wheels of her cart made a squeaking sound as she moved from room to room. She had been working at this school for 15 years now, cleaning classrooms and bathrooms every day after the students left. Sarah was 42 years old and lived alone in a small apartment 3 blocks away from the school. She was not a tall woman, and she carried extra weight that made her feel self-conscious around others. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same blue uniform every day. Most people at the school knew her face, but not her name. To them, she was just the cleaning lady who worked quietly in the background. But Sarah had a secret that nobody knew about. Every night, after she finished cleaning all the classrooms, she would make her way to the school auditorium. This was her favorite part of the job, even though it was also the hardest room to clean. The auditorium had 500 seats, a large stage, and beautiful red curtains. During the day, students used this space for assemblies, plays, and concerts. When Sarah cleaned the auditorium, she would start with the seats. She would wipe down each one carefully, making sure there was no gum or trash left behind. Then she would sweep the floors between the rows. The stage was always the last thing she cleaned. She would mop the wooden floor until it shined under the bright lights. But before she turned off those lights and locked the door, Sarah would do something that would have surprised everyone who knew her. She would walk to the center of the stage, close her eyes, and sing. Sarah had been singing since she was a little girl. Her mother, Maria, had taught her old Spanish songs when they would cook together in their tiny kitchen. Maria had a beautiful voice, and she always told Sarah that she had inherited this gift. But Sarah never sang in front of anyone else. She was too shy, too afraid of what people might think. In school, Sarah had been the target of cruel jokes. Kids made fun of her weight, her accent, and the way she sometimes stuttered when she was nervous. She learned to stay quiet and invisible. She ate lunch alone and never raised her hand in class, even when she knew the answers. By the time she graduated, she had convinced herself that she was not special in any way. After high school, Sarah took the job at Lincoln High School. She needed the money, and cleaning was something she could do without having to talk to many people. The work was hard, but it was honest work, and it paid enough for her to take care of herself and help her mother with medical bills. Sarah's mother had been sick for many years. She had cancer that came and went, and the treatments were expensive. Sarah worked extra hours whenever she could, sometimes cleaning offices downtown on weekends. She never complained about the long days or the tired feeling in her back and legs. Taking care of her mother was the most important thing in her life. It was during one of her mother's hospital stays that Sarah started writing songs. She would sit by her mother's bed for hours, watching her sleep and listening to the sounds of the machines. To pass the time, she would write down her thoughts and feelings in a small notebook. Slowly, these thoughts turned into poems and then into songs. The first song Sarah wrote was about her mother's hands. She remembered how those hands had cooked thousands of meals, braided her hair for school, and held her when she was sad. Now, those same hands looked so small and weak in the hospital bed. Sarah wrote about how much those hands had given her, and how she wished she could give something back. Over the months, Sarah wrote more songs. She wrote about growing up poor, about being afraid to speak up for herself, and about the dreams she had never shared with anyone. She wrote about working late at night in empty buildings, about the loneliness she felt when she went home to her quiet apartment. But she also wrote about hope, about the small moments of beauty she found in her simple life. When Sarah sang these songs alone on the school stage, something magical happened. Her voice, which was often quiet and uncertain during the day, became strong and clear. The words she had written in her notebook came alive when she sang them. In those moments, Sarah felt like the person she was meant to be. The auditorium had perfect acoustics, which means sounds carried beautifully in that space. When Sarah sang, her voice filled every corner of the room. She would imagine an audience sitting in those empty seats, people who would listen to her songs and understand the feelings behind them. She dreamed of applause, of people being moved by her music the way she was moved when she wrote it. Sarah knew these dreams seemed impossible. She was just a cleaning lady who had never performed in front of anyone. She had no formal training, no connections in the music business, and no money to pursue such dreams. But still, every night she would stand on that stage and sing like her life depended on it. Sometimes when she was singing, Sarah would remember her mother's words from when she was young. Maria used to say that everyone has a gift, and that it would be a sin to waste the gifts that God had given them. Sarah wondered if her voice was her gift, and if keeping it hidden was wrong. One night, as Sarah was finishing her cleaning routine, she noticed a flyer that had fallen behind one of the seats. It was advertising the annual Lincoln County Talent competition, which was held every spring at the Civic Center downtown. The winner would receive $500 and the chance to perform at the summer festival. Sarah picked up the flyer and read it carefully. The competition was open to anyone over 18 years old. No experience was required, just the courage to get on stage and perform. Sarah folded the flyer and put it in her pocket. She told herself she was just curious, that she would never actually enter such a thing. But that night, when she stood on the empty stage and sang her mother's favorite song, Sarah felt something different. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to share her gift with the world. The thought scared her, but it also excited her in a way she had never felt before. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding in the shadows and step into the light. Sarah kept the talent competition flyer in her kitchen drawer for 3 weeks. Every morning, while drinking her coffee before work, she would take it out and read it again. The deadline to enter was getting closer, and each day she told herself she would throw the flyer away. But she never did. The flyer became wrinkled from all the times she had folded and unfolded it. She had memorized every word, every detail about the competition. It would be held on a Saturday night at the Lincoln County Civic Center. Each performer would have 5 minutes on stage. The judges were local business owners and a music teacher from the community college. Sarah's mother had been having good days lately. Her cancer treatments were working, and she was able to spend more time at home instead of in the hospital. One evening, while Sarah was making dinner, her mother noticed how quiet and distracted she seemed. "What is bothering you, mija?" her mother asked in Spanish. "You seem like you have something heavy on your mind." Sarah had never told her mother about singing at the school or about the songs she had written. She was afraid her mother would think she was being foolish for having such dreams at her age, but something about her mother's gentle voice made her want to share her secret. "Mama, do you remember when I was little and you used to say I had a gift for singing?" Sarah asked, not looking up from the stove. Her mother smiled. "Of course I remember. You had the most beautiful voice even as a small child. Why do you ask?" Sarah took a deep breath and told her mother everything. She talked about singing alone in the auditorium, about the songs she had written, and about the talent competition flyer hidden in the drawer. Her mother listened without interrupting, her eyes growing brighter with each word. When Sarah finished talking, her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Sarah, my daughter, why have you been hiding this beautiful part of yourself?" she asked. "Music is meant to be shared, not kept locked away in an empty room." "But Mama, look at me," Sarah said, gesturing to herself. "I am not the kind of person who belongs on a stage. People will laugh at me." Her mother shook her head firmly. "People who laugh at others are people who have forgotten how to dream. Your voice is a gift from God, and it would be wrong to waste it because you are afraid of small-minded people." That night, after her mother went to bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with the flyer spread in front of her. She picked up a pen and began filling out the application form. Her hand shook as she wrote her name and phone number. When she got to the part that asked her to describe her act, she wrote simply, "Original song, solo performance." She sealed the envelope before she could change her mind and walked to the mailbox on the corner. As she dropped the envelope inside, Sarah felt a mix of terror and excitement that made her heart beat fast. There was no taking it back now. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call confirming that she had been accepted into the competition. She would be performer number 7 out of 12 acts. The woman on the phone explained that she needed to arrive 2 hours early for a sound check and that she could bring her own backing music if she wanted. Sarah told her she would be singing without any music, just her voice alone. Sarah had 3 weeks to prepare. Every night after work, she practiced her song over and over again in the auditorium. She had chosen to perform the first song she had ever written, the one about her mother's hands. It was deeply personal, but it was also the most honest thing she had ever created. The closer the competition got, the more nervous Sarah became. She started having trouble sleeping and eating. She would look at herself in the mirror and imagine all the ways the performance could go wrong. What if she forgot the words? What if her voice cracked? What if people laughed so hard that she couldn't continue? Sarah's mother noticed her daughter's anxiety and tried to encourage her. "Remember, Miha, you are not performing to impress anyone. You are sharing a piece of your heart. People can always tell the difference between someone who is trying to show off and someone who is speaking their truth." The day of the competition arrived on a cold Saturday in March. Sarah spent the morning trying to keep busy, cleaning her already spotless apartment and reorganizing her closet. She had bought a new dress for the performance, something simple and black that she hoped would make her look more professional. She had never owned anything so expensive, but her mother had insisted it was an investment in her future. As evening approached, Sarah's nerves got worse. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely apply her lipstick. She had never worn much makeup, but she wanted to look her best. Her mother helped her fix her hair, pulling it back in a way that was elegant but still comfortable. "You look beautiful," her mother said, adjusting the collar of Sarah's dress. "But more importantly, you look like yourself. That is all you need to be tonight." Sarah drove to the Civic Center with her mother in the passenger seat. The parking lot was already full of cars, and she could see people walking toward the entrance. Some of them were clearly performers, carrying instruments or wearing costumes. Sarah felt very plain and ordinary next to them. Inside the Civic Center, the main auditorium was buzzing with activity. There were about 300 people in the audience, more than Sarah had expected. The stage was bigger than the one at school, with bright lights that made it hard to see the crowd beyond the first few rows. Sarah checked in with the organizers and received a number 7 badge to pin on her dress. She was directed to a small room behind the stage where the other performers were waiting. The room was crowded and noisy, filled with people doing vocal warm-ups, tuning instruments, and practicing dance moves. Sarah found an empty chair in the corner and sat down quietly. She watched the other performers and felt more intimidated with each passing minute. There was a teenage girl with a professional-looking guitar and a voice coach giving her last-minute tips. A man in a glittery jacket was practicing magic tricks with cards and coins. 2 women in matching outfits were running through a complicated dance routine. Everyone seemed so confident and prepared. They had costumes and props and years of experience performing in front of people. Sarah looked down at her simple black dress and wondered what she had been thinking when she entered this competition. When it was time for the show to begin, all the performers were lined up backstage in order. Sarah could hear the master of ceremonies introducing the competition to the audience. Through a crack in the curtain, she could see that every seat in the auditorium was filled. The first performer was a young man who played piano and sang a popular song from the radio. The audience clapped politely when he finished. The second act was a comedy routine that made people laugh loudly. The third was the dance duo, who received enthusiastic applause for their synchronized moves. As each act performed, Sarah felt herself getting more and more nervous. Her mouth was dry and her heart was beating so fast she thought people might be able to hear it. She tried to remember the breathing exercises her mother had taught her, but nothing seemed to help. When performer number 6 finished their magic act, Sarah knew it was almost her turn. The master of ceremonies was introducing her to the audience, reading from the card she had filled out weeks ago. "Our next performer is Sarah Martinez, who will be singing an original composition." His voice boomed through the speakers. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward the stage entrance. As she stepped out from behind the curtain and into the bright lights, she heard something that made her stomach drop. Scattered throughout the audience, she could hear people whispering and a few quiet chuckles. She knew exactly what they were thinking. Here was this ordinary-looking middle-aged woman in a simple dress about to embarrass herself in front of hundreds of people. She could see some people in the front rows exchanging glances and smiling in a way that was not kind. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she walked across the stage to the microphone. Her legs felt weak, and she was afraid she might trip in front of everyone. The walk to the center of the stage felt like it took forever, and with each step, she could hear more whispers and suppressed laughter from the audience. When she finally reached the microphone, Sarah looked out at the sea of faces staring at her. In the front row, she could see the judges sitting behind a long table. One of them was checking his watch, and another was looking at her with obvious skepticism. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone stand to her height. The simple action seemed to amuse some people in the audience, and she heard a few more chuckles. Someone in the back of the auditorium said something she couldn't quite hear, but it made the people around them laugh. For a moment, Sarah considered turning around and walking off the stage. Every instinct told her to run, to escape this humiliation before it got worse. But then she remembered her mother's words about sharing her gift, and she thought about all those nights singing alone in the school auditorium. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to block out the sounds of the audience. She thought about her mother, sitting somewhere in that crowd, believing in her even when she didn't believe in herself. She thought about the song she was about to sing and why she had written it. Sarah's voice started soft and shaky as she sang the first line of her song. The words came out quietly, almost like she was afraid to let them be heard. Her nerves made her voice wobble, and she could feel her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone stand. "These hands have worked so hard for me," she sang, her voice barely carrying to the back of the auditorium. In the audience, people were still whispering to each other. Some had already decided this was going to be a disaster, and were getting comfortable in their seats preparing to watch what they thought would be an embarrassing performance. A few people in the middle section were holding up their phones, ready to record what they expected would be a viral video of someone failing spectacularly on stage. Sarah could see the judges at their table in the front row. The man who had been checking his watch was now looking at some papers in front of him, not even paying attention to her performance. The woman next to him was writing something down, probably notes about how this was going worse than expected. The third judge, the music teacher from the community college, was at least looking at Sarah, but her expression was polite rather than interested. As Sarah continued with the second line of her song, her voice cracked slightly on a high note. This small mistake made a few people in the audience exchange knowing looks. Someone near the back made a comment that Sarah couldn't hear clearly, but it caused several people around them to laugh quietly. "They've cooked 1,000 meals with love," Sarah sang, trying to ignore the sounds from the audience. Her mouth felt dry, and she wished she had thought to bring a bottle of water on stage with her. The bright lights were hot on her face, making her feel even more nervous and uncomfortable. She could feel sweat starting to form on her forehead, and she worried that her makeup was going to run. Sarah had practiced this song hundreds of times alone in the school auditorium, but performing it here felt completely different. In the empty school, her voice had sounded strong and beautiful to her own ears. Here, with hundreds of people watching and judging, every note felt uncertain and wrong. The teenager with the guitar who had performed earlier was standing in the wings, watching Sarah's performance with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She whispered something to her voice coach, who shook his head sadly. It was clear that they, like many others, thought Sarah was in over her head. "They've wiped away my childhood tears," Sarah continued, her voice still shaky but slowly getting a little stronger. In the third row, a group of teenagers from the local high school were trying hard not to laugh out loud. They had come to the competition expecting to see polished performances by people with real talent. Sarah's nervous beginning was exactly what they had hoped to see, someone who would give them something to joke about later. But scattered throughout the audience, there were also people who were starting to listen more carefully. An elderly woman in the fifth row had stopped talking to her husband and was focusing on Sarah's words. A middle-aged man who worked at the hardware store downtown was leaning forward slightly, trying to hear better over the whispers around him. Sarah's mother was sitting in the seventh row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could see how nervous her daughter was, and her heart ached for Sarah's obvious discomfort. But Maria also knew what Sarah's voice was capable of when she wasn't afraid. She silently prayed that her daughter would find her confidence and show these people what she could really do, and held me close when I was scared, Sarah sang, and for just a moment her voice became clearer and stronger. This small improvement caught the attention of the music teacher judge, who looked up from her notes and focused more intently on Sarah. She had heard thousands of performances over the years, both good and bad, and she was beginning to sense that there might be more to this nervous woman than met the eye. Sarah herself was starting to feel the familiar comfort that came when she sang about her mother. These were not just random words to her, they were her truth, her deepest feelings put into music. As she sang about her mother's hands, she began to remember why she had written this song in the first place. These hands have sacrificed so much for me, she continued, and this line came out with noticeably more emotion and strength. A woman in the back row who had been scrolling through her phone looked up when she heard the change in Sarah's voice. There was something different about the way Sarah sang that line, something that made her want to pay attention. She put her phone away and settled back in her seat to listen. But despite these small improvements, Sarah was still struggling with her nerves. She could see people in the audience who were clearly not impressed, and their expressions made her doubt herself even more. When she reached the chorus of her song, her voice wavered again as she tried to hit the higher notes. "Oh, these precious hands," she sang, but the word precious came out flat and uncertain. Some people in the audience shifted in their seats, and Sarah could hear someone sigh loudly. A man in the fourth row was looking at his program, probably counting how many more acts he would have to sit through. Two women near the aisle were having a quiet conversation about their plans for after the show, clearly having written off Sarah's performance already. The master of ceremonies, who was standing in the wings watching all the performances, was starting to feel bad for Sarah. He had seen many nervous performers over the years, and he recognized the signs of someone who was struggling with stage fright. He hoped Sarah would be able to finish her song without completely falling apart. Sarah's hands were still shaking, and she was gripping the microphone stand so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was hyper-aware of every sound from the audience, every whisper and movement that suggested people were not enjoying her performance. Part of her wanted to stop singing and apologize for wasting everyone's time. But something inside Sarah refused to give up. Maybe it was the memory of all those nights practicing alone in the school auditorium. Maybe it was the thought of her mother sitting in the audience, believing in her. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that she had come too far to quit now. "They've worked from dawn until the night," Sarah sang, and this time her voice was steadier. She was starting to find her rhythm, beginning to remember how the song was supposed to sound. The melody that had come to her so naturally when she wrote it was slowly returning, even in this terrifying situation. Her breathing was becoming more controlled, and her voice was getting stronger with each line. A few more people in the audience were beginning to notice the change. The elderly woman in the fifth row was now completely focused on Sarah, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the words of the song. The hardware store owner had stopped fidgeting and was paying full attention. "To make sure I had everything right," Sarah continued, and for the first time since she had stepped on stage, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the auditorium. Without wavering, the music teacher judge sat up straighter in her chair. She had been judging performances for 10 years, and she knew the difference between someone who was simply nervous and someone who actually had talent hiding beneath their fear. Something about the way Sarah sang that line made her want to hear more. Sarah was beginning to feel more connected to her song, more grounded in the emotions that had inspired her to write it. She thought about her mother's hands as they really were, weathered and worn from years of hard work, but always gentle when they touched Sarah's face or held her hand during difficult times. "These hands have never asked for much," she sang, and the audience could hear that her voice was getting warmer and more confident. Even some of the teenagers who had been preparing to laugh were now listening more seriously. There was something in Sarah's voice that was starting to reach them, something genuine and heartfelt that was different from the more polished but less personal performances they had heard earlier. Sarah was still nervous, and she could still feel her heart beating fast in her chest, but she was also beginning to remember why she loved to sing, why music had always been her refuge and her joy. The song she was performing was not just notes and words. It was her love for her mother turned into music, As she moved toward the second verse of her song, Sarah's voice continued to grow stronger and more sure. The laughter and whispers from the audience were becoming quieter, replaced by something that sounded almost like attention. For the first time since stepping on stage, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she might be able to reach these people after all. As Sarah reached the second verse of her song, something magical began to happen. The nervous energy that had been making her voice shake started to transform into something else, raw emotion and genuine feeling that came from deep inside her heart. Her grip on the microphone stand relaxed and she stood a little taller on the stage. When sickness came and wouldn't leave, Sarah sang, her voice now clear and strong. These hands held mine and helped me believe. The change in her voice was unmistakable. Where before there had been uncertainty and fear, now there was purpose and conviction. Sarah was no longer just a nervous woman trying to get through a song. She was becoming a storyteller, sharing something deeply personal with everyone in the room. The music teacher judge, Professor Helen Carter, felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She had been teaching and judging performances for 15 years, and she knew that what she was witnessing was rare. This wasn't just someone getting over their stage fright. This was an artist finding their voice in real time, right? There on stage. In the audience, the whispers and movement were gradually dying down. People who had been looking at their phones or talking to their neighbors were now focusing their attention on the woman standing alone under the bright lights. There was something compelling about the way Sarah was singing now, something that made them want to listen. Through hospital nights and days of pain, Sarah continued, these hands were sunshine through the rain. Sarah's mother, Maria, felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She recognized this transformation in her daughter. It was the same change that used to happen when Sarah was a little girl and would get lost in her singing while helping in the kitchen. When Sarah sang from her heart, she became someone different, someone powerful and beautiful. The teenage girl with the guitar who had performed earlier was now watching Sarah with complete attention. Her voice coach, who had seen hundreds of amateur performances, was shaking his head in amazement. Listen to that, he whispered to his student. That's what real feeling sounds like. Sarah herself could feel the change happening. It was as if all the fear and nervousness were melting away, replaced by the same feeling she had when she sang alone in the school auditorium. But this was even stronger, because now she had people listening, really listening to her story. And when the doctor said goodbye, Sarah sang, her voice growing richer and more powerful with each word. These hands taught me how not to cry. The hardware store owner, Tom Wilson, found himself completely absorbed in Sarah's performance. He had lost his own mother 2 years earlier, and Sarah's words were bringing back memories of his mother's final days in the hospital. He could relate to every word she was singing. Sarah's voice was now filling every corner of the auditorium with ease. The acoustics that had seemed so intimidating when she first stepped on stage were now working in her favor, carrying her voice to the very back row with crystal clarity. She no longer needed to strain or push. The sound was flowing naturally from her. The group of teenagers who had been preparing to laugh were now sitting in stunned silence. One of them, a girl named Ashley, felt her eyes beginning to water. She had never expected to be moved by anything at this small-town talent competition, but there was something about Sarah's honest emotion that was reaching right into her heart. They showed me strength I didn't know, Sarah sang, and her voice soared on the word strength in a way that made several people in the audience sit up straighter. They taught me how to let love grow. Judge number 2, businessman Robert Hayes, looked up from his papers for the first time since Sarah had started singing. He had been prepared to give her a polite but low score and move on to the next act. But something about the power and emotion in her voice was making him reconsider everything. Sarah was now moving slightly as she sang, her body naturally swaying with the rhythm of her song. She was no longer frozen with fear but was allowing the music to flow through her entire being. Her face, which had been tense with nervousness, was now relaxed and expressive. When I was lost and couldn't see, Sarah continued, her voice growing, even stronger. These hands reached out and rescued me. An elderly man in the back row, Frank Rodriguez, was thinking about his late wife's hands as he listened to Sarah sing. He remembered how those hands had cared for their children, how they had held his during the difficult times in their 50-year marriage. Sarah's song was awakening memories and emotions he had kept buried since his wife's death. The transformation in Sarah was complete now. She was no longer singing to prove herself or to win a competition. She was singing because this song needed to be heard, because these words about love and sacrifice and the power of a mother's touch were universal truths that everyone could understand. These precious hands, Sarah sang as she reached the chorus again, but this time the words rang out with confidence and power. These precious hands that made me who I am. The acoustics of the auditorium seemed to embrace her voice, amplifying not just the sound but the emotion behind it. People throughout the audience were now completely focused on Sarah, drawn in by the genuine feeling in every note. Judge 3, the businessman who had been checking his watch earlier, was now leaning forward in his chair. James Patterson had heard many performances over the years, but he had never heard anyone sing with such raw honesty and emotion. This wasn't a polished, professional performance. It was something much more powerful. Sarah's mother was crying openly now, not from sadness, but from pride and joy. She was watching her daughter become the person she had always known she could be. Maria could see that Sarah was no longer afraid, no longer hiding. She was sharing her gift with the world, just as Maria had always hoped she would. "They've given everything they had," Sarah sang, her voice now commanding the complete attention of every person in the room. Through every joy and every sad, the transformation was visible as well as audible. Sarah's posture was confident now, her face was alive with expression, and her movements were natural and graceful. The woman who had walked nervously onto the stage just minutes earlier seemed like a completely different person from the artist who was now commanding the room. In the wings, the master of ceremonies was shaking his head in amazement. He had introduced hundreds of acts over the years, and he had never seen such a dramatic change in a performer during a single song. Sarah had gone from nervous amateur to compelling artist right before everyone's eyes. "These hands have loved me all my life," Sarah sang, building toward the climax of her song, "through happiness and pain and strife." The audience was now completely silent except for Sarah's voice. People who had been chatting or looking around were now focused entirely on the stage. Some were crying, others were simply mesmerized by the power and beauty of what they were hearing. Sarah could feel the change in the room. The energy had shifted completely from skepticism and amusement to attention and respect. She was no longer fighting to be heard. She was being listened to, really listened to, perhaps for the first time in her life. "And though they're weaker than before," Sarah continued, her voice strong and clear, "they're still the hands that I adore." The teenage performer with the guitar was wiping tears from her eyes. Her voice coach was nodding slowly, recognizing that he was witnessing something special. This wasn't just a good performance. This was the moment when someone discovered who they really were. Sarah felt more alive and more herself than she had ever felt before. This was why she had written this song, why she had spent all those nights singing alone in the auditorium. This moment, this connection with the audience, this sharing of her deepest feelings, this was what music was supposed to be. As she prepared to sing the final verse of her song, Sarah looked out at the audience with new confidence. She was no longer afraid of their judgment. She had found her voice, and she knew that whatever happened next, she had already succeeded in the most important way possible. As Sarah moved into the final verse of her song, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of simply finishing the song as she had written it, she began to speak directly to the audience while the melody continued. Her voice was strong and confident now, filled with the kind of honest emotion that could not be faked or learned. "This song is about my mama," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. "But it's also about something more. It's about all the people who work quietly, who sacrifice without being seen, who love without expecting anything back." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. People who had come expecting light entertainment were now witnessing something much deeper, a window into a life of struggle, love, and quiet heroism. My mother worked 3 jobs when I was growing up, Sarah continued, her speaking voice as compelling as her singing had been. She cleaned offices at night, worked in a factory during the day, and took in sewing on weekends. But she never complained, never made me feel like I was a burden. Sarah's mother, Maria, was sobbing quietly in her seat. She had never known that Sarah understood so clearly what those years had been like, how hard Maria had worked to give her daughter a better life. To hear Sarah honoring that sacrifice in front of all these people was overwhelming. When she got sick with cancer 5 years ago, Sarah said, those hands that had worked so hard became weak and shaky, but they never stopped giving. Even in the hospital, when she could barely lift a cup of water, she would reach out to comfort me when I cried. Judge Helen Carter, the music teacher, was completely absorbed in Sarah's story. She realized that what they were witnessing was not just a performance, it was a testimony, a sharing of truth that was more powerful than any technical skill could ever be. I wrote this song sitting by her hospital bed, Sarah continued, watching those beautiful hands rest on the white sheets. I thought about everything they had given me, everything they had created, everything they had sacrificed, and I realized that I had never properly thanked them. The teenage girl named Ashley, who had been expecting to laugh at the performances, was now crying openly. She thought about her own grandmother's hands, how they had braided her hair and baked her cookies, and held her when she was scared. Sarah's words were making her see those memories in a completely new way. But this song isn't just about my mother, Sarah said, her voice growing even stronger. It's about all the mothers, all the fathers, all the people who work hard every day to take care of the people they love. It's about the hands that serve food in restaurants, that clean buildings at night, that change bedsheets in hospitals. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, felt a lump forming in his throat. He thought about his own rough, calloused hands and how his wife used to say they were the most beautiful hands in the world because of all the work they did to provide for their family. It's about the hands that stock shelves in grocery stores, that fix cars and trucks, that plant seeds and harvest crops, Sarah continued. All the hands that make our world work, that keep our lives running, but that we sometimes forget to notice or appreciate. An older woman in the front row, Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson, was thinking about her own hands and how they had raised 6 children, kept house for 50 years, and cared for her husband through his final illness. She had never thought of her daily work as anything special, but Sarah's words were making her see it differently. I work as a janitor at Lincoln High School, Sarah said, and she could see some recognition in the faces of people who knew the school. Every night I clean classrooms and bathrooms and hallways. Some people might think that's not important work, but I know better. Sarah's voice was filled with dignity and pride as she spoke about her job. She was not ashamed of her work. She was honoring it just as she was honoring her mother's sacrifices. I take care of the place where children learn and grow, she continued. I make sure it's clean and safe for them. My hands might not look important, but they're doing work that matters. Every pair of hands doing honest work is doing something that matters. The audience was completely captivated now. People who had never thought about the janitor who cleaned their office building or the person who served their food were suddenly seeing these workers in a completely new light. When my mother was dying, Sarah said, her voice becoming softer but no less powerful, she held my hands and told me something I will never forget. She said, Sarah, everyone has a gift. Some people's gifts are obvious to the world, but other people's gifts are quiet ones. Your gift is your voice, but it's also your heart. Don't hide either one. Judge Robert Hayes was completely mesmerized. He had judged dozens of these competitions over the years, and he had never heard anything like this. Sarah was not just performing, she was sharing her soul with everyone in the room. I have been hiding both my voice and my heart for most of my life, Sarah admitted. I was afraid that people would think I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong on a stage like this. But tonight I realized that my mother was right. It would be wrong to keep hiding the gifts I've been given. The young performer with the guitar was learning something about music that she had never understood before. All her training and practice were important, but what Sarah had This ability to connect with people's hearts was something that could not be taught. "This song is my way of saying thank you," Sarah said, "not just to my mother, but to everyone who has ever worked hard for someone they love, everyone who has ever sacrificed their own comfort for someone else's happiness, everyone whose hands have given more than they've received." Sarah paused for a moment, looking out at the audience with clear, confident eyes. She could see that her words had touched them, that they were truly listening and understanding what she was trying to share. "My mother is here tonight," Sarah said, and she looked directly at Maria in the 7th row. "These are the hands I wrote this song for, but I hope that when you hear it, you'll think about the hands that have shaped your own life, the hands that have loved you and cared for you and made you who you are." The audience turned to look at Maria, who was crying and smiling at the same time. People began to applaud for her, recognizing her as the inspiration for this beautiful tribute. Maria felt overwhelmed by the love and respect she saw in the faces around her. "So this last verse," Sarah said, turning back to the microphone, "is for all of us, for everyone who has been loved by hands that worked hard and sacrificed much, and for everyone whose own hands are doing that loving work right now." As Sarah prepared to sing the final verse, the entire auditorium was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. She had transformed what started as a simple talent competition into something profound and meaningful, a celebration of love, sacrifice, and the dignity of honest work. Sarah took a deep breath and began to sing the last verse, her voice now stronger and more beautiful than it had ever been. She was no longer just Sarah Martinez, the nervous janitor. She was an artist, a storyteller, a voice for all the quiet heroes whose love makes the world a better place. Sarah took a deep breath and began the final verse of her song. Her voice, now fully confident and rich with emotion, filled the auditorium with a power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Every person in the room could feel that something extraordinary was happening. And when the time came to let go, Sarah sang, her voice strong and clear. "These hands taught me what I needed to know." As she sang these words, Sarah's mind went back to that terrible night in the hospital 6 months ago. She could see her mother lying in the bed, so weak and fragile, but still trying to comfort Sarah, even as her own life was slipping away. "They whispered, 'Don't be afraid to fly,'" Sarah continued, but as she sang the word, "whispered," her voice began to crack slightly with the weight of the memory. The audience could hear the change in her voice, the way emotion was starting to overwhelm her technique. But instead of making her performance weaker, this vulnerability made it even more powerful. People throughout the auditorium were leaning forward, completely absorbed in Sarah's story. "Your voice can help the world get by," Sarah sang, and now her voice was definitely trembling. These had been her mother's actual words, spoken in a voice so weak that Sarah had to lean close to hear them. Sarah's mother, Maria, was crying harder now as she heard her own final words being sung back to her. She remembered that night, how she had used the last of her strength to encourage her daughter one more time. She had known she was dying, and her greatest worry was that Sarah would give up on her dreams. "Sing for those who have no voice," Sarah continued, but her voice broke completely on the word voice. For a moment she couldn't continue singing at all. She stood at the microphone, tears streaming down her face, trying to compose herself enough to finish the song. The auditorium was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. No one moved. No one whispered. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something sacred, a daughter's final tribute to her mother's love and wisdom. Judge Helen Carter had tears in her eyes as she watched Sarah struggle to continue. In all her years of judging performances, she had never seen anything more genuine or more moving than this moment of raw, honest emotion. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and leaned back toward the microphone. When she spoke, her voice was thick with tears but filled with determination. "Those were my mother's last words to me," she said to the audience. "She died 3 days later, but before she left, she made me promise that I would not waste the gifts I had been given. She said that my voice belonged not just to me, but to everyone who needed to hear that they were not alone." The teenage girl Ashley was sobbing openly now, thinking about her own grandmother who had died the year before. Sarah's words were helping her understand things about love and loss that she had never been able to put into words. "Make them feel less alone," Sarah sang, continuing the verse, but her voice cracked again on the word alone. The emotion was so overwhelming that she could barely get the words out. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, was crying for his own mother, who had died when he was just 18 years old. He had never properly grieved her loss, but Sarah's song was opening up feelings he had kept buried for 30 years. "That's what these old hands were for," Sarah sang, and her voice broke completely on the word for. She stood at the microphone, sobbing, unable to continue for several long moments. The audience waited patiently, many of them crying along with her. They understood that this was not a performance anymore. This was a woman sharing the most painful and beautiful moment of her life, with a room full of strangers who had become friends. Judge Robert Hayes was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. He thought about his own father, who had worked in a factory for 40 years to support his family and had never once complained about the long hours or the hard work. Sarah's song was helping him see his father's sacrifices in a new way. Sarah tried again to sing the final lines, but her voice was so thick with emotion that the words came out broken and fragmented. "To give love, and nothing more." She managed to sing, but each word was interrupted by sobs. An elderly man in the back row, Frank Rodriguez, was thinking about his late wife's final words to him. She had also spoken about love being the most important thing, about how the hands that give love are the most beautiful hands in the world. Sarah's song was like hearing his wife's voice again. "I'm sorry," Sarah said to the audience, stepping back from the microphone and trying to compose herself. "I thought I could get through this, but it's still so hard to talk about losing her." "Don't apologize," someone called out from the audience. It was Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson, the older woman in the front row. "You're honoring her. That's beautiful." Several other people in the audience nodded and murmured their agreement. They didn't want Sarah to feel bad about showing her emotions. Her tears were making her song even more meaningful, even more real. Sarah's mother, Maria, stood up in her seat. "Sing, mija," she called out in a voice that carried throughout the auditorium. "Sing for all of us. Sing for everyone who has loved and lost." The sight of Sarah's mother encouraging her daughter gave Sarah the strength she needed. She walked back to the microphone, her face still wet with tears, but her expression determined. "These hands are gone, but not their love," Sarah sang, her voice still cracking but growing stronger with each word. "They live in all I'm dreaming of." The audience could feel Sarah gathering her strength, pushing through her grief to finish what she had started. Her voice was not technically perfect anymore. It was rough with emotion and broken by tears, but it was more beautiful than any polished performance could ever be. "And when my time on earth is through," Sarah continued, her voice growing steadier, "I hope my hands have loved like you." As Sarah sang these final lines about her mother's legacy of love, something extraordinary happened in the auditorium. People throughout the crowd began to think about their own parents, their own children, their own hands, and what they had given or received through them. "These precious hands," Sarah sang one last time, her voice now strong despite her tears. "These precious hands that made me who I am." As the last note of Sarah's song faded away, the auditorium fell into complete silence. For several long moments, no one moved or made a sound. Everyone seemed to understand that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just a performance, but a transformation, a revelation, a sharing of the deepest kind of human truth. Sarah stood at the microphone, tears still streaming down her face, looking out at an audience that was completely captivated by what they had just experienced. She had given everything she had to this song, held nothing back, and shared the most precious memories of her life with a room full of people who had started as strangers. In that moment of silence, Sarah realized that her mother had been right, all along. Her voice did belong to the world, and she had finally found the courage to share it. Whatever happened next, she had honored her mother's memory and her own gift in the most beautiful way possible. The silence in the auditorium stretched on for what felt like forever. Sarah stood at the microphone, tears still wet on her cheeks, looking out at 300 faces that stared back at her in complete stillness. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic outside the building. Sarah began to worry that she had made a mistake. Maybe she had shared too much, been too emotional, broken down too completely for people to respect her performance. She started to step back from the microphone, thinking she should apologize again and leave the stage. Then, from the very front row, a small sound broke the silence. It was 7-year-old Emma Patterson, who had come to the competition with her grandfather. Emma had been fidgeting through most of the other performances, but Sarah's song had held her complete attention. Now, with tears in her young eyes, Emma began to clap her tiny hands together. The sound of that small child clapping alone in the massive auditorium was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Emma's grandfather, James Patterson, looked down at his granddaughter with surprise and then up at Sarah with new understanding. Without thinking, he began to clap as well. Within seconds, the applause began to spread. Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson in the front row started clapping, then the person next to her, then the entire front row. The sound grew like a wave rolling through the auditorium, moving from row to row as more and more people joined in. But this was not ordinary applause. There was something different about it, something deeper and more meaningful than the polite clapping that had followed the other performances. People were not just appreciating a good song. They were responding to something that had touched their hearts in a profound way. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, was clapping so hard his hands hurt. He was thinking about his own mother's hands and how he wished he had thanked her properly before she died. Sarah's song had given him words for feelings he had never been able to express. One by one, people began to stand. First it was Maria, Sarah's mother, who rose from her seat in the 7th row with tears of pride streaming down her face. Then Judge Helen Carter stood up at the judges' table, followed quickly by the other 2 judges. The teenage performer, with the guitar, stood up in the wings, still crying but applauding with enthusiasm. Ashley, the teenager who had come expecting to laugh at the performances, was now standing and clapping while tears ran down her face. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands, how they had taught her to bake cookies and braid friendship bracelets. Sarah's song had helped her understand how precious those memories were. The standing ovation spread through the auditorium like wildfire. Row after row of people rose to their feet, applauding not just with their hands, but with their hearts. The sound was thunderous, filling the space with a wall of appreciation and respect. Frank Rodriguez, the elderly man in the back row, was standing and applauding while thinking about his late wife. For the first time since her death, he felt like someone understood the depth of his love for her and the magnitude of his loss. Sarah's song had given him permission to grieve openly and to celebrate the love they had shared. The applause continued to grow louder and more enthusiastic. People were not just clapping, they were cheering, whistling, calling out words of encouragement and appreciation. Someone shouted, "Beautiful," and someone else called out, "Thank you." The sound was overwhelming and wonderful. Sarah stood at the center of the stage, completely overwhelmed by the response. She had never imagined that her simple song about her mother could affect people this way. She looked out at the sea of standing, applauding people, and felt a mixture of joy, surprise, and deep gratitude. The master of ceremonies, who had been watching from the wings, was crying as he applauded. In 20 years of hosting these competitions, he had never seen anything like this. Usually, standing ovations were polite gestures that lasted 30 seconds or so. This ovation showed no signs of stopping. Judge Robert Hayes was standing and applauding with tears in his eyes. He was thinking about his father's calloused hands and how they had worked so hard to provide for the family. Sarah's song had helped him see his father not just as a provider, but as a hero who had sacrificed his own comfort for his children's future. The applause continued for 2 minutes, then 3, then 4. People seemed reluctant to stop clapping, as if they didn't want this moment of shared emotion and understanding to end. Some people were laughing through their tears, others were still sobbing openly, but everyone was clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Young Emma Patterson was still clapping her small hands together, looking up at Sarah with wide, admiring eyes. She didn't fully understand why all the adults were crying, but she knew that Sarah had done something very special. Her grandfather lifted her up so she could see better over the heads of the standing adults. The teenage girl with the guitar realized that she had just learned more about music in the last 10 minutes than she had in years of formal training. Sarah had shown her that technique and polish were nothing compared to genuine emotion and honest storytelling. She made a mental note to thank Sarah after the competition. Maria, Sarah's mother, was crying and laughing at the same time as she applauded her daughter. She was thinking about all the nights she had worried that Sarah would never find the courage to share her gift with the world. Now, watching hundreds of people give her daughter a standing ovation, Maria felt like all her sacrifices had been worthwhile. The applause reached the 5-minute mark and showed no signs of slowing down. Some people had sat down briefly to rest, their hands only to stand up again and continue clapping. Others were wiping their eyes and then returning to their enthusiastic applause. Sarah finally found her voice and leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you," she said simply, her words barely audible over the continuing applause. "Thank you so much." But the audience was not ready to stop. The applause continued, mixed now with cheers and calls of appreciation. Someone shouted, "We love you, Sarah," and others picked up the chant. The sound was deafening and beautiful at the same time. Judge Helen Carter was thinking about all the performances she had judged over the years. She had heard technically superior singers, people with more training and more polished presentations. But she had never heard anyone sing with such raw honesty and genuine emotion. Sarah had reminded her why she fell in love with music in the first place. The standing ovation finally began to quiet down after nearly 6 minutes, but people remained on their feet. As the applause faded, individual voices could be heard calling out words of encouragement and appreciation. "Beautiful. Thank you. Amazing. We needed to hear that." Sarah looked out at the audience with wonder and gratitude. These people, who had started the evening as strangers ready to judge her, had become a community united by shared emotion and understanding. Her song about her mother's hands had somehow touched something universal in all of them. As the last of the applause died away and people began to sit down, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the invisible janitor who cleaned buildings at night. She was no longer the nervous woman who had walked onto the stage afraid of being laughed at. She was an artist who had shared her truth with the world and had been embraced for it. She was a daughter who had honored her mother's memory in the most beautiful way possible. She was a voice for all the quiet heroes whose love and sacrifice usually go unnoticed. Sarah stepped back from the microphone and walked toward the wings, but the audience began applauding again. They were not ready to let her go, not ready for this moment of connection and understanding to end. Sarah turned back, smiled through her tears, and waved to the crowd that had given her the greatest gift of her life, the knowledge that her voice truly mattered. The rest of the talent competition felt like a dream to Sarah. She watched the remaining 5 performers from the wings, but her mind was still processing what had just happened on stage. When the judges announced the winners at the end of the night, Sarah was genuinely surprised to hear her name called as the unanimous first-place winner. As she walked back onto the stage to accept her trophy and the $500 prize, the audience gave her another standing ovation. Judge Helen Carter handed her the award and whispered in her ear, "That was the most moving performance I've ever witnessed. You have a rare gift." After the competition ended, Sarah was surrounded by people who wanted to talk to her. Strangers approached her with tears in their eyes, sharing stories about their own parents, their own struggles, their own dreams that they had been afraid to pursue. An elderly woman named Margaret told Sarah that the song had helped her understand her own mother's sacrifices for the first time. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, waited in line to speak with Sarah. When his turn came, he took her hands, in his rough, calloused ones. "Thank you," he said simply. "You helped me remember what these hands are really for." He promised to call his own children that night to tell them he loved them. But the most meaningful conversation came when a young woman approached Sarah nervously. It was Ashley, the teenager who had come expecting to laugh at the performances. "I wanted to thank you," Ashley said, her voice shaky with emotion. "I've been angry at my grandmother for dying and leaving me. Your song helped me understand that I should be grateful for all the love she gave me, instead of being mad about losing her." As the crowd in the auditorium finally began to thin out, Sarah and her mother walked to the parking lot together. Maria was beaming with pride, but she was also emotional about hearing her final words to Sarah sung in front of all those people. "I meant every word I said to you that night in the hospital," Maria told her daughter as they got into the car. "But I never imagined you would turn those words into something so beautiful. You made me feel like my whole life had meaning tonight." The next morning, Sarah's phone started ringing early. Word about her performance had spread quickly through their small town. The local newspaper wanted to interview her, and the radio station asked her to come in and sing her song on the air. But the call that surprised her most came from a woman named Rebecca Chen, who said she was a talent scout from Nashville. "I was visiting my parents here in town and came to the competition last night," Rebecca explained. "I've been in the music business for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like your performance. Would you be interested in discussing some opportunities?" Sarah was skeptical at first. She had heard stories about people who prey on hopeful performers, making promises they can't keep, but Rebecca was patient and professional, explaining that she worked for a small but respected record label that specialized in authentic storytelling music. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life began to change in ways she never could have imagined. A video of her performance, recorded by someone in the audience on their phone, was posted online and began to spread rapidly. Within days, it had been viewed by millions of people around the world. The comments on the video were overwhelming in their positivity. People from dozens of countries shared their own stories about parents who had sacrificed for them, about workers whose contributions often go unnoticed, about the power of love to transcend all boundaries. Sarah's song had touched something universal in people everywhere. Rebecca Chen flew Sarah and her mother to Nashville to meet with the record label. They offered Sarah a recording contract that would allow her to maintain control over her music, while giving her the support she needed to reach a wider audience. The advance money they offered was more than Sarah made in 2 years at her cleaning job. But Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. She chose to continue working part-time at Lincoln High School, even after signing the recording contract. "This job taught me who I am," she explained to Rebecca. "It kept me humble and connected to real people with real struggles. I don't want to lose that." Sarah's first album, titled These Precious Hands, was released 6 months after the talent competition. The title song, the one she had performed that night, became a hit on both country and adult contemporary radio stations. But more importantly, it became an anthem for working people everywhere. The album's success led to concert opportunities across the country. Sarah performed at venues ranging from small-town theaters to major city auditoriums. At every show, she would tell the story behind These Precious Hands and dedicate the song to all the people whose quiet sacrifices make the world a better place. One of Sarah's most meaningful performances was at a hospital in Chicago, where she sang for cancer patients and their families. After the show, a young boy whose mother was receiving treatment approached Sarah with a drawing he had made of hands holding a heart. "This is for you," he said. "Thank you for singing about my mommy's hands." Sarah established the Precious Hands Foundation with part of her earnings from the album. The foundation provided scholarships for children of working-class families, helping them pursue education and dreams that might otherwise be out of reach. The first scholarship went to Ashley, the teenager who had been moved by Sarah's performance at the talent competition. Maria's health continued to improve, and she was able to travel with Sarah to some of her concerts. At each show, Sarah would introduce her mother to the audience, and Maria would receive standing ovations of her own. "This is the woman who inspired the song," Sarah would say. "These are the hands I wrote about." The success of Sarah's music career opened doors she had never dreamed of, but it also brought opportunities to honor the values her mother had taught her. She performed at benefits for hospital workers, janitors' unions, and immigrant families. She never forgot where she came from or the people who had shaped her. 3 years after that night at the talent competition, Sarah was invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, one of the most prestigious venues in country music. As she stood on that famous stage, looking out at an audience that included some of the biggest names in music, she thought about the long journey that had brought her there. Before she began to sing, Sarah spoke to the audience about her mother, about working as a janitor, and about the night when everything changed. "I learned that our dreams don't have expiration dates," she told them, "and that the most beautiful voices often come from the most unexpected places." As Sarah sang "These Precious Hands" on the Grand Ole Opry stage, she could see people in the audience wiping their eyes. Country music legends and young fans alike were moved by the same honest emotion that had captivated a small-town talent competition 3 years earlier. After the performance, Sarah was approached by Dolly Parton, one of her musical heroes. "Honey," Dolly said, "that song just reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. You sing the truth, and that's the rarest thing in this business." Today, Sarah continues to live in her small hometown, though she has moved to a larger house where her mother can live comfortably. She still cleans at Lincoln High School 2 days a week, and she still practices her songs alone in the auditorium, late at night. But now, when she sings in that empty room, she knows that her voice has already reached the world. The school has put up a plaque in the auditorium honoring Sarah's achievements, but she asked them to dedicate it not just to her, but to all the school employees who work quietly to create a safe and clean environment for learning. "This is for everyone whose hands make this place special," the plaque reads. Sarah's story has inspired countless others to pursue their dreams, regardless of their age, background, or circumstances. She receives letters from people around the world who tell her that her music gave them courage to sing, to speak up, to honor their own parents, or to see the dignity in their own work. But perhaps the most important change in Sarah's life is the simplest one. She is no longer afraid to let people see who she really is. The woman who once hid in the shadows has learned to step into the light, sharing her gifts with confidence and grace. Every night, before she goes to sleep, Sarah looks at her own hands. Hands that clean and create, that hold microphones and comfort others, that carry on the legacy of love her mother taught her, and she knows that her mother was right all along. Everyone has a gift, and the greatest tragedy is not using it to make the world a little more beautiful. The audience that once laughed when she entered now understands what Sarah knew all along: that the most precious gifts often come wrapped in the most ordinary packages, and that love, when shared openly and honestly, has the power to change everything.